The men who would survive this day would speak of it in hushed tones for the rest of their lives. The ones who did not survive never saw it coming. If you're watching this, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. We have an incredible community here, and your support means everything. The story of the shell that terrorized Canadian soldiers is a story of German engineering genius, desperate Allied courage, and the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. It begins not on the beaches of Normandy or Dieppe, but in the quiet laboratories of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium in 1937. German weapons engineers had a problem. Their conventional explosive shells, the standard ammunition that every military in the world used, were not performing as expected against aircraft. When a shell struck an airplane, it either punched through, leaving a clean hole, or it fragmented into shrapnel that peppered the fuselage with small wounds. Neither effect was reliably killing enemy planes. The British Spitfires and Hurricanes kept flying even after taking multiple hits. The German Air Ministry demanded something better. They needed a shell that would not just damage, but obliterate. The answer came in the form of an ancient concept, reborn for modern war, the Meningeschoss, the mine shell. To understand why this weapon was revolutionary, you need to understand how conventional shells work. A standard high-explosive round has thick metal walls surrounding a small core of explosive material. When it detonates, most of the energy goes into fragmenting the metal casing into lethal shrapnel. The explosion itself is almost secondary. This design works well against soft targets, against trucks and infantry in the open, but against the aluminum skin of an aircraft, against the reinforced structures of a heavy bomber, fragmentation alone was not enough. The pieces would pass through, leaving holes that a skilled pilot could often nurse back to base. The mine shell reversed this equation entirely. Instead of thick walls and a small explosive charge, German engineers created a shell with walls so thin they were almost paper-like, filled to capacity with high explosives. When this shell hit, it did not fragment. It detonated with tremendous force, creating a pressure wave that could rip apart aluminum, buckle steel, and vaporize human flesh. The shell was manufactured using a completely new process. Rather than casting or machining the projectile from solid metal, engineers formed the shell casing the same way ammunition cartridges are made, drawing high-quality steel into impossibly thin walls. The first mine shells appeared in 20mm caliber for the MG-FF cannon. They carried 17 grams of explosive, nearly 3 times the payload of conventional shells of the same size. The improvement in lethality was immediate and terrifying. German pilots reported that single hits were now crippling enemy aircraft that had previously shrugged off multiple rounds. The Royal Air Force began losing planes at alarming rates during the Battle of Britain, their pilots puzzled by the newfound deadliness of German fire. But this was only the beginning. The Germans quickly realized they had stumbled onto something much bigger than an improved aircraft round. The physics of the mine shell scaled beautifully with size. As the diameter increased, the volume of explosive grew exponentially. A 30mm mine shell could carry 85 grams of explosive, nearly 5 times what the 20mm version held. And the Germans were already working on even larger calibers. The weapon that would haunt Canadian soldiers was born from this realization. The Mk-108 cannon, a 30mm autocannon, designed specifically to fire mine shells at Allied heavy bombers. Where previous cannon had needed dozens of hits to bring down a B-17 Flying Fortress, the Mk-108 required only 3 to 5 direct hits. A single mine shell could sever control cables, rupture fuel tanks, and kill crew members with its pressure wave alone. British testing showed what happened when one of these shells struck an aircraft wing. The explosion did not just punch through. It warped the metal, buckled the structural supports, and compromised aerodynamic integrity in a way that traditional ammunition never could. The Americans learned this lesson the hard way during the bomber offensive against Germany. By 1944, more than 50% of American aircraft losses over German territory were attributed to flak guns, many of them firing mine-shell ammunition. The terror these shells inspired extended far beyond their physical effects. Bomber crews spoke of watching sister ships simply disintegrate in midair, struck by something invisible that left nothing but falling debris. But the mine shell did not stay confined to air combat. The Germans adapted this technology for ground-based anti-aircraft guns, and it was these weapons that Canadian soldiers would encounter in some of the war's most brutal fighting. The 2-centimeter Flak 30 and Flak 38, rapid-firing autocannons that could pour mine shells into advancing infantry with devastating effect. The 3.7-centimeter Flak 18 and Flak 43, medium cannon that combined the mine shell's explosive power with enough velocity to engage aircraft and ground targets alike, and the legendary 8.8-centimeter Flak guns, the famous 88s, which, while firing conventional ammunition, were part of the same defensive networks that incorporated mine shell weapons at shorter ranges. The Canadian Army's first large-scale encounter with this arsenal came on August 19, 1942, the Dieppe Raid, Operation Jubilee. To this day, it remains one of the bloodiest single days in Canadian military history. The plan seemed simple on paper. Nearly 5,000 Canadian soldiers, supported by British commandos and a small American contingent, would land on the French coast at Dieppe. They would destroy German defenses, gather intelligence, and withdraw before the enemy could mount an effective response. It was supposed to be a demonstration of Allied capability, a rehearsal for the eventual invasion of Europe. Instead, it became a slaughterhouse. The assault began unraveling almost immediately. A chance encounter with a German coastal convoy alerted defenders hours before the main landing. By the time Canadian soldiers approached the beaches, the Germans were waiting. Hidden in concrete bunkers, positioned on cliffs overlooking the landing zones, they had prepared killing fields that would make the beaches of Dieppe into a charnel house. The Royal Regiment of Canada approached Blue Beach at Puys. They were 35 minutes late, the crucial element of pre-dawn darkness already fading. As the landing craft lowered their ramps, German machine guns opened fire. But it was not just machine guns. The defenders had 20-millimeter flak cannon positioned to sweep the beach with mine shell ammunition. Canadian soldiers trying to cross the narrow strip of sand found themselves caught in interlocking fields of fire. The mine shells did not simply wound, they obliterated. One survivor described the moment of impact. The man next to him simply ceased to exist. There was no warning, no visible projectile, just a flash and a pressure wave, and nothing where his friend had been standing. The thin walls of the mine shell maximized the explosive effect at the moment of detonation. When these rounds struck flesh, the results were catastrophic. Men were torn apart before they could even begin to fight back. Of the 556 soldiers of the Royal Regiment of Canada who landed at Puys that morning, 200 were eliminated and 264 were captured. Only 65 made it back to England. The regiment was functionally destroyed in less than 3 hours. Similar scenes played out across the other landing beaches. At the main beach in front of Dieppe, Canadian tanks foundered on the slippery shale, their treads unable to gain purchase. German guns methodically eliminated them one by one. Infantry who made it past the waterline found themselves pinned against the seawall, unable to advance into the withering fire. The 20-millimeter mine shells proved particularly effective against the landing craft themselves. These flat-bottomed vessels offered little protection to the men packed inside them. A direct hit from a flak cannon firing mine shells did not just puncture the hull, it detonated inside the crowded compartments with apocalyptic results. Photographs taken by the Germans after the battle show landing craft filled with the remains of men who never made it to shore. By the time the order came to withdraw, the beaches of Dieppe were covered with the bodies of Canadian soldiers. 907 Canadians were eliminated outright. 586 returned to England wounded. 1,946 became prisoners of war. In total, 68% of the Canadian force that landed became casualties. It was a disaster that would shape Canadian military planning for the rest of the war. The lessons learned at Dieppe came at an almost unbearable cost. Allied planners realized that frontal assaults against fortified positions required overwhelming firepower, detailed intelligence, and careful suppression of defensive weapons before troops ever reached the shore. These lessons would inform the planning for Operation Overlord 2 years later. But for the families of the young men who died on those French beaches, the lessons provided cold comfort indeed. If you are finding this story compelling, now is the perfect time to subscribe to the channel. We explore the forgotten corners of military history, the weapons and tactics that shape the modern world. Hit that notification bell so you do not miss our upcoming content. The mine shell continued to evolve throughout the war. By 1943, German engineers had developed streamlined versions that improved ballistic performance without sacrificing too much explosive capacity. The Ausführung C mine shell for the Mk-108 carried 72 grams of PETN explosive, slightly less than the original 85-gram payload, but with significantly better aerodynamics. These shells maintained their velocity over longer distances, making them more accurate against fast-moving targets. The Germans also began experimenting with even larger calibers. Calculations showed that a 55-millimeter mine shell carrying 400 grams of explosive could reliably destroy a heavy bomber with a single hit. Development began on the Jarrett 58 anti-aircraft gun and the Mk-112 aircraft cannon, both chambered for this devastating caliber. Allied bombing of German industrial facilities prevented these weapons from reaching mass production, but prototypes were tested and proved the concept viable. One weapon that did reach operational deployment was the R-4M rocket. This air-to-air missile carried a 55-millimeter mine shell warhead packed with 520 grams of high explosive. When Messerschmitt Tu-62 jet fighters armed with R-4M rockets intercepted Allied bomber formations in the final months of the war, the results were devastating. On one occasion, German jets armed with these rockets eliminated 25 B-17 bombers from a formation of 425 aircraft in a matter of minutes, without suffering any losses themselves. The mine shell had proven its worth as an aircraft destroyer beyond any doubt. But it was in ground combat that Canadian soldiers continued to encounter these weapons with the greatest frequency. The Battle of the Scheldt, fought from October to November 1944, brought the full horror of German defensive technology to bear against Canadian troops once again. The strategic situation in the autumn of 1944 demanded the opening of the port of Antwerp. Allied supply lines stretched back to Normandy and the Channel ports, and the advancing armies were running critically short of everything from ammunition to food. Antwerp was the largest port in Western Europe, capable of supplying the massive Allied forces pressing toward Germany. But the Germans had fortified the Scheldt estuary, the waterway connecting Antwerp to the North Sea. Until these defenses were cleared, the port was useless. The task fell to the 1st Canadian Army, reinforced by Polish and British units. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds commanded the Skjold Canadian Corps and planned the operations that would clear the estuary. What faced his men was a defender's paradise. The flat polder country of the Netherlands had been deliberately flooded by the Germans, turning the landscape into a maze of dikes, canals, and isolated patches of high ground. Movement was channeled along narrow raised roads that the defenders had registered for artillery and mortar fire. Every avenue of advance became a killing zone. The German 64th Division under General Knut Eberding held the Breskens pocket south of the Western Scheldt. Eberding was an experienced Eastern Front veteran, an expert in defensive warfare, who had been given an almost impossible amount of weaponry with which to resist the Canadian advance. When the German 15th Army had retreated from the Pas-de-Calais region of France, an enormous quantity of guns and ammunition ended up in the Breskens pocket. The haul included 120 mm anti-aircraft guns. These weapons became the terror of the Canadian infantry. Used as super-heavy machine guns, the 20 mm flak cannon firing mine shell ammunition could shred a man in seconds. The thin-walled explosive rounds detonated on contact with anything, including branches, debris, or bodies. Canadian soldiers advancing through the flooded polder country learned to fear the distinctive sound of these rapid-fire weapons more than anything else the Germans possessed. One burst could eliminate an entire squad before anyone had time to take cover. In addition to the 20 mm guns, Eberding had 23 of the legendary 88 mm flak guns. While these fired conventional ammunition rather than mine shells, their effect on Canadian armored vehicles was equally devastating. A single direct hit from an 88 could destroy any Allied tank. Combined with 455 light machine guns and 97 mortars, the defensive network in the Breskens pocket represented a concentration of firepower that seemed almost impossible to overcome. The Canadian 3rd Division's 7th Brigade drew the assignment of crossing the Leopold Canal and establishing a bridgehead in the pocket. The attack began on October 6, 1944. Siemens had planned to achieve surprise by avoiding a preliminary bombardment and instead using Canadian-built Wasp universal carriers equipped with flamethrowers to incinerate the German defenders. The Wasps launched their barrage of flames across the canal, and the assault troops scrambled up the steep banks to launch their boats. But the Germans had dug in too well. Many escaped the flamethrowers in deep bunkers and emerged to pour fire into the exposed Canadians. The Royal Montreal Regiment Company, tasked with establishing the initial bridgehead, was nearly destroyed on the edge of the canal. Machine gun and mortar fire swept the waterway, and only a handful of Montrealers made it to the far side. By that evening, most of the company that had been so eager to see action was eliminated. The Regina Rifles and Canadian-Scottish Regiment established their own footholds, but German counterattacks prevented any significant expansion of the bridgeheads. For 3 days, the Canadian infantry clung to their narrow strips of captured ground, while German artillery systematically pounded their positions. The 20 mm flak guns proved particularly effective at suppressing any movement. Soldiers attempting to reinforce the bridgeheads or evacuate wounded had to cross the canal under constant fire. The mine shells made the crossing a death sentence for many. The fighting reached a ferocity that veterans would compare unfavorably to the worst days of Normandy. One survivor from the Royal Winnipeg Rifles described the scene in his unit's war diary. Heavy casualties were suffered by both sides, and the ground was littered with both German and Royal Winnipeg Rifle dead. The Canadian-Scottish Regiment used anti-tank weapons to blow down walls of houses where German resistance was strongest. The war diary noted with grim humor that Piats and bazookas are quite handy little housebreakers. By October 9th, the gap between the Canadian bridgeheads was closed, but the cost had been staggering. In terms of numbers lost as a percentage of those engaged, the Battle of the Leopold Canal was one of the bloodiest battles for Canada in World War II. 533 men were eliminated, and another 70 broke down due to battle exhaustion. 1 in every 2 men who crossed the Leopold became a casualty. The men who broke down exhibited the symptoms that would later be recognized as combat trauma. They curled into fetal positions and refused to move, speak, eat, or drink. Their spirits had been shattered by the stress of continuous fire, the sight of comrades being torn apart by explosive shells, the knowledge that death could come at any moment from weapons they could not see and could not stop. The mine shell, with its devastating explosive effect, contributed significantly to these psychological casualties. The wounds it caused were not the clean punctures of rifle bullets. They were catastrophic injuries that left witnesses traumatized. General Eberding, committed to National Socialist ideology, ordered that German soldiers who retreated without orders were to be regarded as deserters and summarily executed. Their families at home would be designated enemies of the German people. This fanatical determination to hold every inch of ground meant that the Canadians would have to eliminate or capture virtually every defender. There would be no easy surrenders, no mass defections. The Canadian 9th Brigade conducted an amphibious operation to outflank the German defenses. Using Buffalo amphibious vehicles, crewed by the British 5th Assault Regiment of the Royal Engineers, they crossed the mouth of the Brockman Inlet to land behind the German lines. The operation achieved surprise, but once again the Germans recovered quickly and counterattacked with characteristic ferocity. The Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders, known as the Glens in the Canadian Army, spent 2 days fighting for the village of Hoofdplaat. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders took 3 days to capture the village of Driewagen. The regimental war diary noted with surprise that the enemy are a much better type than we have been running into lately. These were not demoralized troops ready to surrender. They were experienced soldiers fighting with effective weapons in terrain that favored defense. The Canadian artillery proved essential to survival. By day, German counterattacks were broken up by concentrated shell fire that took a heavy toll on attacking infantry. The war diary of the 15th Field Regiment for October 12th recorded that today we were the busiest we have been since Cormel and Fallet's pocket days. But German night attacks enjoyed more success as the darkness limited the effectiveness of artillery observation. The Highland Light Infantry lost and then retook the village of Beervliet during a confused nocturnal engagement. Throughout the fighting, the 20mm flak guns continued to take their toll. These weapons could fire rapidly, traverse quickly to engage new targets, and deliver mine shell ammunition with devastating effect against exposed infantry. Canadian tactics evolved to minimize exposure to these weapons. Small unit leaders learned to move through cover, to use artillery and air support to suppress flak positions before advancing, and to accept slower progress in exchange for reduced casualties. But even with these precautions, the mine shells continued to claim lives. The battle for the Scheldt stretched into November. By the time the last German positions were cleared on November 8, 1944, the 1st Canadian Army had suffered more than 20,000 casualties. 6,367 of these were Canadian. The cost was enormous, but the strategic objective was achieved. Antwerp was open to Allied shipping, and the crucial supplies that would sustain the final push into Germany began flowing through the port. The mine shell's influence extended beyond the immediate casualties it caused. The psychological impact of facing these weapons shaped Canadian tactical doctrine for the remainder of the war. Officers learned that overwhelming firepower had to precede any assault on fortified positions. The days of accepting heavy casualties in exchange for rapid advance were over. Canadian commanders became known for their methodical approach, their willingness to use airstrikes and artillery bombardments to soften defenses before committing infantry. This was not cowardice. It was hard-won wisdom purchased with the blood of soldiers who had faced mine shell fire at Dieppe and the Scheldt. The technology of the mine shell did not disappear with Germany's defeat. After the war, the victorious Allies studied captured German weapons with intense interest. The advantages of the mine shell concept were immediately apparent, and weapons designers in Britain, France, and the Soviet Union began incorporating these principles into their own ammunition. the British Ardennes cannon and the French Difa cannon, both 30mm weapons that became standard aircraft armament for NATO air forces in the 1950s, were directly descended from the German Mauser Mk 213 project. They fired mine shell ammunition that traced its lineage directly to the Menengeschoss, developed in 1937. The air-to-air rockets that armed interceptors during the Cold War often featured mine shell warheads. The technology that had terrorized Canadian soldiers at Dieppe became the backbone of Western air defense for a generation. Even modern ammunition designers struggle to match the explosive payloads achieved by German mine shells during World War II. The PGU-13 B-high explosive incendiary round fired by the GAU-8 Avenger cannon on the A-10 Warthog carries only 58 grams of explosive, compared to the 72 to 85 grams carried by German 30mm mine shells 70 years earlier. The Russian 30mm OFZ shell carries just 48.5 grams. The Menengeschoss represented a peak of explosive efficiency that modern designs have not exceeded. The human cost of this technology is harder to quantify. The veterans who survived encounters with mine shell weapons carried memories that never faded. The sudden violence of these explosions, the way they erased men from existence without warning, left psychological scars that lasted lifetimes. Family members of soldiers eliminated by mine shells often received only the vaguest details of their loved one's fate. The wounds caused by these weapons frequently made identification impossible. At Dieppe, the task of recovering and identifying Canadian dead fell initially to the Germans and later to local French civilians who risked punishment to give the fallen soldiers proper burials. Many graves in the Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery contain the remains of men who could not be identified. They died facing a weapon so powerful, so precisely engineered for destruction, that it left nothing by which they could be known. The story of the mine shell is ultimately a story about the industrialization of death. German engineers applied sophisticated manufacturing techniques and advanced chemistry to create a weapon that maximized lethality within the constraints of existing gun systems. They succeeded beyond their expectations. The shells they designed eliminated Allied airmen by the thousands and contributed to the death of Canadian soldiers on beaches and in flooded polders across northwest Europe. But the same industrial capacity that created the mine shell also produced the Allied response. American factories turned out aircraft faster than German flak could destroy them. Canadian shipyards built landing craft to replace those lost at Dieppe. Allied combined arms doctrine evolved to suppress defensive weapons before infantry advanced. The mine shell was a marvel of destructive engineering, but it could not overcome the fundamental imbalance of industrial power that determined the war's outcome. For the soldiers who faced these weapons, such strategic calculations meant little. What mattered was the man beside them, the objective ahead, and the chance of surviving to see another day. The Canadians who landed at Dieppe, who crossed the Leopold Canal, who fought through the flooded fields of the Scheldt, did so knowing that German weapons could end their lives in an instant. They advanced anyway. That courage, multiplied by thousands of individual decisions to keep moving forward despite the fear, eventually overwhelmed even the most sophisticated defensive technology. The mine shell gave the Germans a significant tactical advantage in defensive engagements. It allowed a relatively small number of weapons to inflict disproportionate casualties on attacking forces, but it could not compensate for Germany's strategic weaknesses. The Allied air forces eventually achieved superiority despite the mine shell's lethality. The Canadian Army eventually cleared the Scheldt despite the weapons arrayed against them. Victory came not through superior technology, but through determination, logistics, and the willingness to pay the price that victory demanded. Today, the beaches of Dieppe are peaceful. Tourists walk the same shale where Canadian soldiers fell. The Leopold Canal flows quietly through farmland that shows no sign of the desperate fighting that once occurred there. But in cemeteries across northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, rows of white headstones mark the final resting places of young Canadians who encountered the mine shell and did not survive. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered. The weapon that cut them down was a product of human ingenuity applied to the darkest possible purpose. The men who faced it were not soldiers from some distant age. They were young men who had grown up during the Depression, who had enlisted to fight fascism, who found themselves facing technologies designed specifically to destroy them as efficiently as possible. Many of them never saw the shell that ended their lives. They advanced into fire that came from weapons hidden in bunkers and emplaced on cliffs, and they kept advancing until they could advance no more. The mine shell represents a particular kind of military innovation, not a weapon system designed to win wars through strategic advantage, but a round of ammunition engineered to kill individual human beings with maximum efficiency. The Germans who designed it were talented engineers solving a technical problem. The Canadians who faced it were young men who had never heard of the Menengeschoss until its effects tore through their ranks. If this story has moved you, if you want to understand more about the weapons and tactics that shaped the Second World War, subscribe to the channel and join our community. Leave a comment telling me which forgotten weapon you want us to explore next. History remembers the great battles and famous generals, but sometimes the most important stories are about the technology that made the fighting so terrible and the ordinary soldiers who endured it. The mine shell was Germany's secret weapon, a devastating innovation that caught Allied forces unprepared. But secrets do not stay secret forever. The Allies adapted, learning to suppress defensive positions before exposing their infantry. They developed tactics to minimize the mine shell's impact, accepting slower advances in exchange for reduced casualties. And ultimately, they won the war not through superior weapons, but through superior industrial capacity and strategic vision. The Canadian soldiers who faced the mine shell at Dieppe and the Scheldt paid the price for this education in blood. Their experience shaped Allied planning for operations from D-Day to the final push into Germany. Every lesson learned about defensive weapons, about the need for combined arms coordination, about the importance of suppressive fire before assault was purchased with the lives of men who advanced into fire they could not suppress and could not survive. They never saw it coming. But their sacrifice ensured that those who followed would be better prepared. That is the legacy of the Canadian soldiers who faced Germany's mine shell, and that is why their story deserves to be told. The early morning fog clings to the water like a shroud. Landing craft engines rumble in the darkness. Thousands of young Canadians grip their rifles, hearts pounding, as the French coastline comes into view. They have no idea that the Germans are waiting with a weapon so devastating, so precisely engineered, that within hours the beaches will run red. A shell that seems to appear from nowhere, detonating with a force that defies its size, tearing through bodies and armor alike.